Can you imagine a place where children have to leave their homes to sleep elsewhere every time night falls, just so they won't be abducted? In northern Uganda, for many years, that was a nightly routine. When darkness came down, children slipped on their worn-out sandals, clutched plastic bags holding a few changes of clothes, and quietly walked into town to sleep on hospital verandas, under church roofs, in the corners of closed markets. No one taught them this survival lesson. The older ones led the younger, teaching themselves how to move in groups, how to listen for sounds, how to stay silent. The adults stood in the doorway, watching them go, trying not to cry, just listening to the darkness and asking themselves, will we still be able to count all of our children in the morning? Here, war does not show up as arrows on a map, but as a child who does not dare sleep in their own home. Behind that strange routine is the name Joseph Kony and the LRA, a man who claimed to carry a sacred message, promised to protect the community and purify evil, then turned the very children of that community into soldiers, into slaves, into tools for spreading fear. Like every episode on this channel, this video does not aim to romanticize or justify any organization or act of violence, but to understand how they are organized and repeated. In this episode of Terror Files, we will not only recount the crimes, but analyze how Kony constructed a sacred aura around himself, how the LRA operated like an assembly line that used children as fuel for war, and why a society can be broken to the point where trust between neighbors becomes a luxury. To understand why someone like Kony could drag an entire region into a nightmare, you have to look at northern Uganda before you look at the man himself. This is the land of the Akoli, where life is tied to fields, to herds of cattle, to red earth houses and evenings gathered around the cooking fire. But over many years, peace was replaced by a feeling Americans have a very specific word for: being left behind. After power changed hands in Kampala in the late 1980s, the North became a place where suspicion piled on top of suspicion. Rebels, government troops, reprisals, sweeps, all of it taught people a new habit. Do not ask too many questions, do not speak too loudly, and always be ready with an escape route. When a state tries to re-establish order through fear, that order sounds like the thud of boots on the ground, not like the sound of children laughing. Many villages were pushed into makeshift camps, where fences and guard posts sprang up faster than schools and clinics. Malaria, hunger, and the humiliation of living in dependency made trust within the community thinner by the day. People looked at strangers as if looking at a trap. They also looked at the familiar with caution, because no one was sure who was listening, who would inform, who would turn a sentence into a crime. In that atmosphere, someone who knows how to speak the language of pain will have an advantage. When you have lost land, lost safety, lost your future, a promise of meaning, of belonging, of revenge can sound like a lifeline. And from that lifeline, people can be pulled straight to the bottom. When war drags on long enough, the line between fighter and civilian blurs. Civilians become food stores, sources of information, and also hostages. Children, light, malleable, unable to defend themselves, are turned into strategic assets. Seen through a security crime lens, this is the classic environment for an armed organization built on abduction and terrorizing civilians to emerge. A weak state, a humiliated community, and nowhere left to place your trust. If northern Uganda is a piece of fractured land, then Kony grew up right on those fault lines. He did not emerge from a military academy, nor was he a religious scholar. Many local accounts describe a fairly ordinary Akoli youth. Villages, harvest seasons, red earth houses, small churches, and evening prayers where people sought a bit of reassurance amid uncertainty. At one point, He was mentioned as a boy serving at Mass in church. But in a region where Christianity lives alongside indigenous beliefs, the line between faith and superstition is sometimes as blurry as cooking smoke. When war and repression drag on, people cling more easily to supernatural signs and neat, definite explanations. Kony learned that very quickly. He listened to stories about sin and salvation, and also to rumors about spirits, curses, protective charms. Then he picked whatever was most effective and mixed them into a message that made people both afraid and hopeful. He did not need complex language. He used short sentences that sounded like commands and small rituals that felt like evidence. In a community driven to exhaustion, certainty looks like leadership. A man who speaks firmly, walks straight, and looks people in the eye is easily seen as the chosen one. And from that moment on, that aura begins to operate like a trap. Not an aura of kindness, but the aura of someone who dares to promise, who dares to say that your humiliation has a cause, that your suffering has someone who must pay for it, that this chaos can be purified. When a society is sinking in fear, people will follow the one who speaks as if he has the answers, even if the price is the future of their own children. From a criminological perspective, this is a very familiar common denominator. An individual with just enough religious spiritual capital, combined with prolonged war, can build for himself the image of a warrior prophet to justify violence. From that seat of aura, Kony stepped into another phase, turning faith into discipline. He did not persuade through argument. He laid down rules. In the gatherings, prayers and verses of scripture were recited evenly, decisively, like a drumbeat. Listeners were promised purification, a new community where humiliation would be washed away. But immediately after came prohibitions, obligations, and punishments for those who hesitated. In a land already used to the sound of guns and boots, many people began to confuse order with fear. Radicalization does not happen in a single moment. It happens through habit. When you hear every day that the world has only two sides, the pure and the traitors, you gradually start to see your neighbors as question marks. When you're told that every pain has a specific enemy, you think less about the real causes and more easily believe in commands. Kony built a kind of battlefield religion that was at once scripture, talisman, and rulebook. Holy oil, ashes, whispered words about spirits, all of it made people believe that violence had been authorized from above. The frightening thing is that this discipline struck directly at children. A child dragged from home does not understand politics, only fear and the desire to survive. They are taught to be silent, to obey orders, and to see violence as a test of faith. When obedience becomes the condition for survival, you no longer need to persuade, you only need to repeat. And outside, parents told their children to change routes, not to call strangers by name, not to look too long at anyone at a crossroads. Stories around the cooking fire turned into warnings. Silence spread like mist. In that mist, an armed group can grow without facing open resistance. Fear buys them time, and time turns an organization into a structure. If you look at it as a radicalization model, you will see all three layers: simplified ideology, repeated ritual, and punishment as spectacle. That is how a religious political movement slides very quickly into the form of a violent cult. The LRA did not grow like a normal army. It grew like an assembly line, and the raw material of that line was children. When an armed group has no solid base, no steady budget, cannot recruit the way a state does, it will choose the cheapest way: kidnapping, seizing the future, then using that very future to continue the war. The raiding parties usually appear when the village has gone quiet. They move along the red dirt roads, cut across fields, through rows of trees, knowing exactly which house has many children, which house has a sick person, which house will panic easily. They round up children along with food and bedding. Older children are forced to carry heavy loads. Younger ones are dragged along to keep up with the marching pace. The next morning, one roof is missing a pair of sandals. One bowl is missing a person. And the whole village understands that silence is the way to survive. In that system, boys are forced to learn how to shoot, how to ambush, how to obey orders like a machine. What they really learn is to cut off the road back home. When you are forced to do the unforgivable, you fear going back more than you fear staying. As for the girls, they are turned into both reward and burden, a status defined entirely by the power of the man with the gun. That is not war. That is slavery under another name. To keep the machine running, the LRA does one more thing. They change the names of those they capture, split them into small groups, and place guards right inside the group. Information travels by word of mouth, by couriers, by decoy trails. One village is attacked to warn another. A child who escapes is used as a lesson for those who remain. Fear becomes the common currency. But what keeps the LRA alive for so long is not only violence, but the discipline of fear. Orders pass through small units, along the forest, across borders, disappearing and then reappearing. Each camp is a warped school, teaching that the outside world contains only enemies and prey. Prayers are used as the rhythm of roll call. Ritual is used to bind belief, and punishment is used to crush any thought of escape. From the perspective of international law, this is a combination of many crimes: systematic kidnapping, the recruitment and use of children in war, slavery, and gender-based violence. But for the villages of northern Uganda, all those terms collapse into a single reality. They are living within reach of an assembly line of violence whose center is children. The LRA left behind many tragedies, but if you only talk in numbers, you will miss the most terrifying part. The most terrifying thing is how they strike at the places that keep a society feeling normal: schools, churches, camps for the displaced, the roads children take to and from home. All of them can become points where childhood is taken away. In October 1996, at the Abduction Girls' Boarding School, a quiet night was torn apart. Imagine 139 schoolgirls being taken, and hundreds of families waking up to the same emptiness. Parents stood at the gates calling their children's names until their voices were hoarse. Later accounts show the girls were herded away in the dark, forced to walk quickly, forced to stay silent. For a community that placed its hopes in education as a bridge out of poverty, that abduction was like someone snatching that bridge out from under their feet. In every house, the empty chair was not only the absence of a child, but the absence of a future. Then came the image that made an entire region change its sleeping schedule: lines of children walking at night. When darkness fell, they left their villages to sleep in town, on hospital verandas, under church roofs, in the corners of closed markets. No one teaches children to survive by migrating every night, but many of them learned the back ways, learned how to listen for sounds, learned how to hold their breath. Some carried a thin shirt and a bottle of water. Some clutched prayer beads as if, by holding on tightly enough, they would not be pulled out of their own lives. In 2004, in Barlogno, which was supposed to be the last refuge for families who had fled their homes, violence came again. A place meant for people on the run became a place where all they could do was hold each other and try to stay alive. After that came the overcrowded clinic, hallways packed tight, scraps of paper with the names of the missing passed from hand to hand, and red eyes from sleepless nights. When fear shuts like a door, people postpone weddings, stop going to market, avoid gatherings, and learn to live smaller. And when it was pushed out of Uganda, the LRA did not disappear. It drifted into the border forests, where the state is thin, roads are few, and cries for help hardly reach anyone. At the end of 2009 in Makambo, human rights investigations recorded more than 300 civilians killed in a series of attacks. The formula does not need a big stage. It only needs isolation, lack of protection, and fear deep enough for a community to silence itself. Putting these milestones side by side, you will see that the LRA did not only take lives, they took away the habit of trusting. When school is not safe, church is not safe, and a shelter is not safe, society begins to shrink. In the language of human rights, these are systematic attacks on civilians. In everyday language, it is the moment when a region understands that even the safe place can disappear overnight. After those years, the war no longer lay only in the villages. It moved into another phase, the hunt. Once the whole world had seen children turned into troop numbers, the name Joseph Kony became an obsession in every security bulletin. The International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant in 2005, and many countries offered rewards for information leading to his arrest. On paper, that was the moment justice stepped onto the stage. But on the ground, it was a game of chase between technology and jungle, between satellite maps and nameless footpaths. And with each passing night, one more household turned its lights off early to listen. Intelligence networks were expanded. Raids took place at night. Drones circled above the treetops. Radio signals were replayed in segments. Calls were traced. Each vehicle recorded as a faint shadow on reconnaissance images. In the operations room, people pinned photos onto maps, circled coordinates, waited for one link in the chain to tremble. But Kony understood that game. He moved constantly through remote border regions, broke into small groups, changed hideouts, changed intermediaries, and used fear to maintain discipline. Some pursuits ended with an empty hut, footprints washed away by rain, and cooking ashes still warm. The one being hunted always seemed half a step ahead. While the networks were being redrawn on the table, on the ground communities in Congo, the Central African Republic, and South Sudan still lived with the feeling that no one would arrive in time. Each report could save lives, but could also drag an entire village into danger if exposed. And when you ask victims' families what they want, the answer is often not revenge. They want to know where their children are. They want a full stop to their waiting. That is why this hunt is both a military campaign and a search for stolen dignity. And the longer he goes uncaptured, the harsher the message. The one who causes suffering can still live beyond the reach of the law. This is also a difficult question for international justice. When an armed leader is hiding in weak borderlands, how long can the distance be between an arrest warrant on paper and the feeling of being protected in real life? When the gunfire began to die down, many people thought the story was over. But for the children who had been taken away, the war did not end on the day they came home. A child stepping back over the threshold after many years is not the same child as on the day they were abducted. They carry invisible things with them. The scenes they had to witness, the acts they were forced to commit in order to survive. Parents look at their child, both happy and afraid, unsure whether they should hug them tight first or ask what happened first. In many communities, those children are seen as victims, but there are also people who whisper. They once carried guns, once walked with the abductors, once stood on the other side. The feeling of betrayal and pity are woven together, turning every reunion into a kind of test for the whole village. In the Akoli region, there are traditional rituals for reconciliation, to sit together, to share responsibility and pain. But no ritual is big enough to erase memories of killing from a child's mind. Many of them grow up not knowing where they belong. In the bush, they were taught that the world consists only of enemies and orders. When they return, the world suddenly has schools, markets, festivals, but also scrutinizing looks and whispers behind their backs. How is a young person who was once praised for his brutality supposed to relearn how to live as an ordinary human being? Farming, running a small shop, raising children. And the parents have to learn not to ask for too many details, because every question can pull the whole family back into that nightmare night. At the national level, trials, amnesty policies, and psychological support programs are all necessary efforts. But at the family level, justice sounds very different. It is a mother daring to tell her child that the blame does not rest on them alone. It is a community daring to accept that the one who caused harm was at one time also a child with their hands tied. It is the slow negotiation between memory and the future. From a security and social perspective, if this legacy is not dealt with properly, the formula LRA used, turning children into tools, using humiliation to legitimize violence, will continue to live on in the way a new generation understands power and honor. Joseph Kony may one day be captured, or may die in some corner of the forest without anyone knowing. But the more important question is, where the formula of violence he leaves behind will go next. Every place where the state collapses, communities are humiliated, and children are left behind always carries the risk that another version will appear, with a different name. From a crime file perspective, the LRA is not just the story of a fanatical leader. It is an example of how an armed movement can exploit power vacuums, religion, and collective humiliation to turn kidnapping and terrorizing civilians into its central strategy. And that is why stories like this need to be told, not to sow fear, but to recognize early similar warning signs elsewhere. If you want Terror Files to keep dissecting such extremist formulas, please subscribe to the channel, leave a comment about the detail that haunts you the most, and share the video. These stories only truly have meaning when they are not buried in the old news section, and when they help us recognize sooner the places where children are paying the price for adults' mistakes.